Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101 and welcome to the Genesis series. I'm your host, Brian, Christian apologist. Most of y'all know me by now. Um, Today we are going to be having a video called Speciation and Created Cons. This is going to be my Created Cons video for my Genesis series, and it's a big one. Not a like long big one, but an important one. And we're going to be talking about various things in Created Cons. We're going to get really into it. We're going to talk about so-called nested hierarchies that are brought up by evolutionists and things like that, and it's going to be cool. Our guest today is Karina Altman, who is a zookeeper and a specialist in, I guess, the area of zoology and dealing with animals and things like that. And she's dealt with a lot of animals. It's pretty cool the way she discusses this, and so she's literally the best person to talk to when it comes to Creative Cons. So I'm glad to, I'm happy to have her on my channel. Um, Without further ado, let's dive in. Hello, welcome to Apologetics 101. I'm here today talking to Karina Altman from Answers in Genesis. She's new to this channel, so I'm gonna let her introduce herself real quick.
Hi guys, as you mentioned, my name is Karina Altman. I am the zoo content manager for Answers in Genesis. So I've worked in zoos and aquariums around the United States for the last 17 years now. So my background, I have a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from Texas A&M University, and I have a master's in biology from Miami University, and I'm currently pursuing my doctorate in educational leadership from Liberty University. So during my career in the zoo world, I've worked with over 100 different species of animals, everything from marine life like dolphins and penguins and sea lions to terrestrial animals like camels, zebras, ostriches, sloths, kangaroos, snakes, spiders, scorpions. So I have a wide variety of experience with animals. I've been at Answers in Genesis for almost 9 years now. Started out as just a little zookeeper and kind of risen through the ranks. So now I am responsible for all the animal shows, programs, outreach, any zoo media like social media. I also do a lot of web content. I've got a bunch of articles online about animals. I do the web page design, anything animal related, basically, I'm going to do. I also have a book called Awesome Facts About Animals, and I write regularly for Answers Magazine. So in the April edition, I will have an article about bull sharks in there. So pretty much anything animal related, content related, I do for Answers in Genesis. I'm also one of their speakers. I do talks on kinds and animals on the ark and various other animal related topics. So I kind of wear a lot of hats here, but it's a lot of fun.
Awesome. All right. Of course, Liberty University is actually my alma mater.
Oh, really?
Yes. I love Liberty. I plan on going back. I got to pay off the last two classes I had. I'm paying by pocket. Like I think I owe like $300 more. After that, I'll go back for my final class and I'll get my bachelor's of science degree.
That's
But yeah,
great.
so
It's actually my first time going to a Christian university. All my other schools have been secular. So I'm actually different from a lot of people here at the ministry. I was raised believing in evolution. I started out believing in molecules to man evolution, and I later became a creationist through my studies in science.
right. I originally was evolutionist as well
Oh,
before I
cool.
was a Christian actually. Then I started reading the Bible and I realized you can't fit millions and billions of years in the Bible. Just doesn't work. But all right. There's something I was going to ask you about. Do you have a master's in zoology or something like that? I couldn't remember.
Master's in biology.
Master's in biology. Okay. So uh, what was your bachelor's in again?
Marine biology. I used to work
Marine
with
biology.
marine life a lot.
Okay. All right. So I wasn't sure if you're a zoologist or just zookeeper. I know there's a distinction between the two.
I mean, I have studied plenty of zoology and I've worked in zoos my whole life directly with animals. I was zookeeping for many years. I'm technically a manager now, but I still take care of animals. So, but yes, I have plenty of knowledge of zoology.
Okay. Awesome. Good. Good. All right. Um, okay. I got a series of questions here. You received my questions, correct?
Yep, I'm ready to
All
go.
right. Awesome. Okay. For the first question, what are created kinds? I know that they're also referred to as baramins. Could you describe that for us?
Yes, baramin is just the Hebrew term for created kinds. So the Hebrew bara means created, the Hebrew min means kind. So baramin's created kinds. They're interchangeable terms. So created kinds are the categories of life that God created 6,000 years ago. So the Bible tells us in Genesis that God created the animals according to their kinds. Later, he brought animals to Noah to board the ark according to their kinds. We see this term mentioned many times throughout scripture. There is some confusion because in today's society, we're often used to talking about animals through the term species. And in today's world, a created kind is not the same thing as a species. So species typically refers to the most specific level of animal classification, which we'll get to shortly, I think. But a kind is a much more broad term. It usually encompasses multiple species. So for instance, you have the horse kind or the equine kind includes horses, donkeys, zebras. The dog or canine kind includes wolves, coyotes, dogs, right? The feline or cat kind includes tigers, lions, leopards. So animals within a kind share the common ancestors created during creation week. They share genetics. They can often hybridize, but basically they're a genetically related group of animals that God created. They're today are descendants from the created kinds God made 6,000 years ago.
Right. Um, uh, on the modern classification system, though, would you say that they're mostly associated with family, or would you say that it just depends
It
on
really depends. So, for instance, with birds, a lot of times the bird kinds often fall at the order level, which is one higher than family. Sometimes with amphibians, they may fall at like the genus level, which is one lower than family. So, we generally will say kind of family level, but it is not always consistent because the terms that we use to classify animals today are man-made terms, right? They're not necessarily biblical. So when we're going about biblical kinds, they don't really fit neatly into a man-made category. So that's where we have to go into the genetic studies. But typically your kind is going to fall at the family order-ish level. Just depends on what animals you're talking about.
right? I know that we're going to be talking about that here in a little bit as well on the man-made classification system. Um, but I would like to ask you one other follow-up question on species. Does it fall into the species category at times? I've read an article that says sometimes it does.
Potentially, especially if you have monotypic animals. So I'll get into this later too, but monotypic animals are animals where they're basically the only one left of their kind. So they're going to be the only representative in order, family, genus, species, all the way down. So it is possible for that to be the case, but generally a kind is going to be a much more broad term than what we think of as species.
Right. All right. My next question is, what is speciation exactly?
So speciation is when a group of animals within a kind distinctly separate from other members of the kind because they develop unique or recognizable characteristics or behavior from the others. So it is not a creation of a new kind. It's basically a creation of a new distinct observable group within a kind.
So yeah, you would classify it as a kind of like a subgroup that is variating within that major classification of kind.
Yep.
Awesome. And of course, my next question is related to that. Do YECs agree with speciation?
Absolutely. I mean, certainly we see it all the time. So if you think about 6,000 years ago when God created those original kinds, they would have think of them being as generic representatives of their kinds. So God would not have been creating lions and leopards and tigers and jaguars and cheetahs, right? He would have created these generic cats. And those original cats would have had a lot of genetic potential that is now filtered down into recognizable species that we see today. And it was important for God to give these animals a lot of genetic potential at the beginning because the world has gone through many changes since then, and God is omniscient. He knew these events would happen. So this ability to adapt and change to fit their environment was especially important after the fall and after the global flood, because the world is very different, right? If you look at the world today, is there just one habitat? No, right? There's tundra, there's scrub, savanna, rainforest, temperate forest. There's even different biomes underwater. And God says multiple times in scripture that he wanted his animals to multiply and fill the world. Well, they've got to have this genetic potential to be able to succeed in that. So that's why we get, the bear kind. We've got representatives in the tundra and we've got representatives in the rainforest. They're all still bears. They haven't turned into anything else, but the potential for the ability to survive in these different habitats was already there. Where we differ from the idea of speciation in the secular world is that molecules to man evolutionists believe that all life descended from one mysterious common ancestor. And over millions of years, they somehow gained enough information to change from one kind to another kind to another kind. Because again, in order to go from a molecule to a man, you need a tremendous gain of information. Whereas biblical creationists who use the Bible as our authority and not man's ideas, we believe that there were multiple common ancestors to life, right? God created many kinds of animals 6,000 years ago. And then from those original kinds, you get the speciation of the species we now see today. And the mechanisms for that change all affected genetic information that was already in place. It was already in the genetics. They didn't get anything new. One kind didn't turn into a new kind, but we do see changes.
Right. I'm gonna ask you this question because I know that one of my questions is gonna pertain to a particular clip. I don't know if you saw the clip or not. By
Yeah, I watched
Erica.
the portion. Mhm.
Okay. Her name is the that we're gonna watch later. The clip is by evolutionist named Erica from Gutsy Gibbon. I don't know. Y'all heard of Erica
I
before?
hadn't before this, no.
Okay. She tries to respond a lot to Answers in Genesis, a lot on her channel, her YouTube channel. But anyway, she mentions in there something about bear dogs and also dog bears. What exactly are they, and are they an actual kind? What is going on there?
So as far as extinct animals go, both creationists and evolutionists are limited by the observational evidence that we have, right? We do not have these animals in front of us anymore. We cannot take blood samples from them anymore and run the kind of genetic testing that we do on animals that are alive today. Can we make guesses based on the evidence that is in front of us? Yes, but that is a historical science, right? So that's where it goes back to what is our foundation when we are making guesses about the past. Evolutionists like her are standing on a foundation of millions of years, life evolved, kinds turning into new kinds, right? Whereas we have a completely different foundation for history. And so we're going to get two different answers by looking at the same skull, right? So as far as a biblical perspective, we can't say for sure what these animals were because they're not in front of us anymore. We can guess based off of similarities to other organisms. So they could have potentially belonged to one of the kinds that are still alive today, like the dog kind or the bear kind, or they could have been in their own kind. The fact is, no one can say for certain because these animals are not in front of us anymore.
Right. Kind of like there are animals that have those kinds of hybrid type names like dogfish or something, and catfish
Right.
and yeah, and no one thinks to relate it to a cat or a
And
dog.
right,
Oh, go ahead.
right. Even the name that we give them, like bear dogs, dog bear, that is based off of guesses, right? So they didn't come with name tags on the fossils to tell us exactly what they are. We can only make inferences based off of the observational evidence, and then those are going to be based on our worldviews. So hopefully that makes sense.
Right. All right. Well, let's talk about the modern classification system. What exactly is it? And how relative is it really when it comes to created kinds?
So the modern classification system, which we call taxonomy, was founded by a man named Carl Linnaeus. He was a Swedish botanist from the 1700s. And during his lifetime, he wrote 7 editions of his book, which are called Systema Naturae, which introduced the modern taxonomy system to the scientific world. That's why he's called the father of modern taxonomy. We still use his methods today. Now, Linnaeus was actually a creationist Christian. He quotes his thoughts about God in his book. I often quote him in my talks. But basically, he saw the general order that appears in nature and wanted to organize it for us humans to better understand, because God calls us to discover his world, right? So he just tried to organize life forms to make it easier for scientists to study. And so in his system, there are a minimum of 7 groups called taxons that grow from broad to specific. So the basic 7 that you're usually going to hear about in science class are your kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, there are other little ones in there like domain and clades and things, but we won't get into that whole mess. Taxonomy is something that is ever changing because our understanding of nature changes constantly. And taxonomy is also sometimes based on your worldview too. But overall, to avoid complications, you got kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, going from broad to specific all the way down.
Okay, I got a couple follow-up questions on that. Would you say that our modern classification system, there's a lot of evolutionary presuppositions that go into it, that have been filtered into it by evolutionists when they
There's,
look at, go ahead.
yeah, there certainly can be, because again, it's a tricky science. And if you're coming from an evolutionary worldview where you're assuming that everything has a common ancestor, you are going to be making different assumptions about animal relations than maybe a creationist would. However, there are similarities in organisms that, oh, it makes sense to kind of group them together as a category when discussing them, right? So like mammals, reptiles, they share a few common characteristics. So then in human speech, when we're talking to each other, we don't have to say lizards and snakes and crocodilians and tuatars. We can just say reptiles and okay, we know what we're talking about. We're talking about animals that have scaly skin and are ectothermic. Okay. So it's basically a way to help us talk about the world around us. The connections between groups can sometimes be based on evolutionary models. However, there are some connections that make sense within a biblical worldview too. Again, it's just kind of a way for us humans to organize our world so we can better study it.
Um, they do lump humans and primates together. They claim, in fact, sometimes they'll even take animals that are clearly primate and put them as part of our lineage in the past, like in as far as fossil goes. Now I know they've got their assumptions that follow along with that, but would you say that that would be an example of their worldview influencing how they're classifying this?
Yes, because according to their worldview, all life comes from a common ancestor, right? So we're all, these organisms. However, in the Bible, God makes it very clear that humans are separate and distinct from the entire rest of his creation because we are made in God's image. So that's where your worldview differences are going to make a difference as well. One other example that I can think of in my evolution classes in college, a lot of times birds were grouped under reptiles now because of the idea that their theory that dinosaurs evolved into birds. So in some textbooks, they've actually completely removed class Avis, which is the birds, and they're just under reptilia now. So now you have avian reptiles and non-avian reptiles. That is another evolutionary influence because the Bible clearly states that God created birds, flying creatures, a day before land animals, which includes many reptiles, right? So again, that's where that evolutionary worldview can influence the published taxonomy. And so we as Christians just have to go into looking at taxonomy, realizing their worldview, our worldview, and be discerning when we're looking at those things. I will say, though, it makes it easier to teach people when I can say things like mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and they know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So generally, it's a good way of discussing different various organisms, but obviously, someone's worldview can still play into how they classify these things.
Yes.
Okay. Um, I think I had another question along those lines, but we're just going to move on. Um, all right. What is a species, and why is this term disputed today? Because I know there's evolutionists that dispute exactly what that is. And it's kind of hypocritical when they try to accuse creationists of not having a definitive way of defining kinds, and they can't decide what species is.
Yes,
But
very true. This is actually a point I discussed in one of my grad school classes. And that overall, a species is your most specific level of animal classification. Yes, so there's subspecies, yes, but overall, broadly, your species is your most specific level of animal classification. However, there is no solid scientific definition of a species. In my grad school research through scientific literature, I have found 26 different definitions of species. The reason they cannot clearly define it because the animals are not behaving like a species. So one of the classic definitions of species includes reproductive isolation, meaning species only breed within their species. But that doesn't happen. Species interbreed constantly. We'll talk more about hybrids later, I know, but they're not behaving the way they're supposed to, which is a real problem for molecules to man evolution. So because they're not behaving this way, you can't define it that way. What is interesting is that the animals behave like created kinds. They do behave like the Bible says they're going to behave, but we can't have that, right? And that's why hybrids, it's a big taboo in the zoo world. It's a big taboo like in the evolutionary world because it's a huge problem for the molecules to man evolution. But hybridization makes perfect sense in a biblical worldview. Of course, animals who are genetically related, who share an ancestor, who were created in the same kind, of course, they're going to breed together if they can. So yeah, so species, there's a definition everyone understands, but if you're trying to actually define it, you can't because the animals aren't behaving that way. It's a man-made term.
Right. Now, of course, originally, I think I don't know if I included this as a later question. I think I did.
Yeah, I know what you're going to ask, and it's a
Yeah,
later question. Yeah,
yeah. But there's actually well, I'll just go ahead and ask it, and then when I get to the question, I'll
yeah,
skip
go
it.
ahead.
But it concerns let me see the question how I worded it here. Um,
I've got
yeah,
it. It's not 15.
did creationists come up with our definition of created kinds not being exactly the same as species post hoc after the fact of argument, meaning post hoc argument is like after the fact, and a lot of evolutionists try to accuse us of only saying, "Hey, look, kinds is not on the same level as species," because they realize species change over time. And they say, "Oh, you're coming up with that argument after that." But you sound like you're very familiar with that objection. So
Yes.
go ahead.
So the term kinds originates in Genesis 1, right? So it's right there in the Bible. That is a concept that existed before Latin became a language, right? So the term kinds does originate in Genesis 1 in God's word. The foundation for its definition of what it is right there in scripture. The actual term species is Latin and it basically means biblical kind. The word genus also refers to a biblical kind. So that's why when Linnaeus was developing his taxonomy, he used these Latin terms. So yes, the term species and genus used to be synonymous with created kind. But around the mid to late 1700s, the term species changed to take on the meaning that it has today, which is that very specific group like level of animal taxonomy. So when the church was talking about species as unchanging kinds, when species obviously change now today, right, there is some argument there, but that's because species was originally synonymous with kinds, which don't change, right? The dogs are dogs, the bird or the bears are bears, the cats are cats. They're not changing. So that's why we see some confusion there. But kinds are not changing. Species, as we know the term today, do change, but only within their kind.
And the word that how people understand the word species changed over time as you
Yeah, that's why that confusion has been caused. So
yeah.
yes, the term species has changed from meaning created kind to this very specific thing that we
One
know
article,
today.
one article on your site had referenced that what they're doing is of equivocation because now that everybody's understanding of species change, and they say, how can you claim fixity of species? And so that's why a lot of young Earth creationists started using the word fixity kinds. So in one sense, it's always been fixity of kinds. It's just a question of how you understand the word species, and the word species is now being understood as a subgroup
Yeah.
within a larger body. And so as a result, we had to in order to communicate what we're saying better, we had to change it so that people understand that we're talking about fixity of kinds, right?
And it's like the term evolution, how it can mean two different things today, right? So that's why I always talk to people when you're when you're discussing evolution with someone, always ask them to define, what do you mean by evolution? Because evolution today can just mean any change, right? And do we see changes in animals? Yes. So in that sense, yes, we see changes in animals. Or do you mean evolution in the historical science of molecules to man, kinds changing into kinds over millions of years? That we do not have evidence for. So it's very important, like you said, always ask people to define their terms. What do you mean by species? What do you mean by evolution when you're talking to them?
Right. That clip that I sent you, that's one of the things that Erica kept doing. She kept bouncing back and forth,
Yes.
like she would go to the species, said, "We know species change." Said, "Okay, we agree species change over time." And she would say, like, "We know that populations can change over time. We don't disagree with populations changing over time. The issue
Right.
is Darwinian evolution, as you refer to it, molecules to man evolution."
I always say molecules to man evolution when I'm talking about it, so
Yeah,
people are crystal clear what I'm talking about. Yeah.
yeah. That their belief that all life is related. It's not a question of uh the fact that organisms change over time or even the amount of change. Some people talk about how the amount of change. That's red herring. We don't argue that. Our argument is the kinds of changes you're claiming
Yes.
that's happening over time. So I like to say like young Earth Christians believe in kind of vertical change, whereas evolutionists are believing in a horizontal change, and they're equivocating and they're arguing from a vertical to a horizontal change, and we're saying no, that didn't happen. This happened.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, let's move on.
Question 6.
See, well, are we on question 6? What is the
Yeah.
molecule? Yes. Question 6. Are there morphological differences between created kinds, like anatomical differences that we can look at? I know there's going to be genetic differences, but are there anatomical differences? If you want to discuss some stuff, I know that I watched some videos of yours and I love seeing you talk about facts about animals and things like that. So if you want to discuss some examples, that'd be fine.
So there can be morphological differences. And again, for viewers, morphological is physical attributes, basically. So there can be morphological differences between kinds. And that recognition of morphological differences is called cognitum, where like you can look at a dog and look at a cat and tell me, like, just, hey, they're different based on their morphology. However, there can be similarities too. So that's why morphology is not a good determiner of differences in kinds, which is something I think that girl was trying to claim as well. We don't just rely on morphology. For example, dogs and cats, even though you can look at them and tell that they are different kinds, well, but they both have 4 legs, they both have fur, they both have 2 ears, they both give live birth, they have backbones, they breathe air with lungs. So they do have a lot of similarities morphologically as well. And that common design, you would expect animals designed by a common designer to have some similarities because they're living in the same planetary conditions, under the same physical conditions, with the same nutrient needs. So of course you're going to see some common characteristics in God's creatures. I always compare it to an artist. Like you can recognize a Monet painting from a Van Gogh painting, from a Jackson Pollock painting, right? Because they have a common design among them. So I look at God's design, and so you're going to see some common features amongst his creatures. So that's why like morphology is not a good way to determine kinds, right? And you kind of go back to the coconut joke where coconuts have milk and they have hair, so aren't they mammals, right? No, but so what really is distinguishing kinds from the observable ones that we can test today is looking at their genetics, right? We can see through their genetics that dogs and cats are different. We can also observe, like, you're not going to see a dog and cat interbreeding with each other, right? So looking at the observable evidence, which we're able to do for dogs and cats today, even though they have some morphological similarities and differences, that's not like the ultimate determiner of whether they're in the same kind or not.
I have to ask you this because I know the answers Jess talked about. I know Ken Ham talks about it a lot, and I love bringing it up to evolutionists. The duck-billed platypus.
Yeah, of the
It's
plot.
got similarities. It's with different animals, but it's a mammal, and it's the only mammal that lays eggs. So,
Actually, there are other mammals that lay eggs, the
yeah,
echidnas.
yeah, I think I did read that. Yeah, there are other, but some people do say that it's the only mammal that lays eggs. What is your take on the duck-billed platypus? Could you? Because I know that's a
Yeah, platypus are fun animals, and there are other animals that are similar. They're just not as famous, where they have morphological characteristics of like 17 different things. And so it's really hard for the molecules to man evolutionists to determine their evolutionary history, so to say, right? Because there's so many different characteristics, they're hodgepodge, they don't match the lineages, right? And so they kind of throw a wrench in their ideas. So yeah, I always think that God made a few of those animals just to like laugh at us trying to classify things. So yeah, platypus are fun creatures. They have a lot of unique characteristics.
They have similarities to other animals too, right?
Yeah, I mean they lay eggs, but they nurse their young with milk, but they also have they have oh my gosh, what is the word? Electrosensory organs on their bill, and they also have webbed feet, and they have fur, and they have a beaver tail, and they have venomous spurs. And so yeah, there's just a whole hodgepodge of characteristics
And the
that
way
don't make
they lay their eggs
glow,
too,
they glow. Yeah.
and their claws, and they what exactly are they their own kind, or are they related to other kind or
At
another
this
kind?
time, they are one of those monotypic animals where it's just them left. Could they have potentially had other members of the kind in the past? Yes, that they may have gone extinct, but in today's world, from our current observational research, they appear to be monotypic.
All right. All right, let's move on to 7. What are breeds and selective breeding? I know you talked about selective breeding before.
Yes, and the reason I cover this in my lectures is because, especially a few decades ago, a lot of people were taught that selective breeding proves evolution. So, selective breeding is simply when humans cross animals together to isolate desired traits, whether that's appearance-related traits or behavioral traits. So then a breed then is a stock of animals within a species that have distinctive appearances or behaviors developed by selective breeding. But breeds are not species, so they're not in that taxonomy ladder we've been covering. Breeds are going to fit within a species. So for example, all 400 plus dog breeds today, no matter what size, shape, color, whether it's a Great Dane or Chihuahua, all 400 of them belong to just one species, which is Canis familiaris, or in some cases, Canis lupus familiaris, depending on who you talk to. So there's not like Great Danes are not a separate species from a Chihuahua. But if you keep in mind, even with all these breeds of dogs, they are still dogs, right? They have not turned into anything else. When you selective breed, you are isolating certain traits and then you are getting rid of the traits you don't want. So you're not gaining new information to get a Chihuahua, right? It's still a dog. All of the genetic potential for those dog breeds would have been placed into the canine kind at the beginning of creation by God. And then we humans just pick and choose the genetic traits we want, isolate those, remove the rest.
I can't remember if this is one of my questions or not, but we can use this as a follow-up question if it's not. But I do have a question on that. My understanding is all the breeds of dogs that exist today came about within the last 500 years. Is that correct?
Most of them. So not all. We never, yeah, universals are usually not true, but many of the 400 dog breeds we see today that are still left, because many dog breeds have also gone extinct, have been selectively bred within the last 500 years, and most of those have actually come about in the last 150 years. So that's a very extreme amount of variation within a kind that took place in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, the reason I asked that because some people come up with like a straw man, like with all those breeds of dogs on Noah's Ark. It's like, well, none of them were on Noah's Ark.
There would have been one pair of the canine kind on Noah's Ark. Yep.
Yeah, but there wouldn't be hundreds of breeds. I mean, they didn't even exist at the time. The breeds that we have
Yeah, like
today.
not. Yeah.
So some people will say, "You think all those breeds were on Noah's Ark?" It's like, nope, I don't. Right. All right. So we're at 8. Okay, this is the one where you alluded to earlier, hybridization and interbreeding required for created kinds. Would you say that's an essential requirement as
No,
far
it
as
isn't. So hybridization, hybrids do prove that animals are in a same kind, but it is not necessary for animals to hybridize to belong to the same kind. So for example, you will never see a tiger breeding with a house cat. It's going to eat the house cat, right? But tigers breed with lions, lions breed with leopards, leopards breed with cougars, cougars breed with ocelots, ocelots can breed with house cats. House cats can also breed with sand cats, servals, caracals, African wild cats, Asian leopard cats, Chinese mountain cats, European wild cats, fishing cats, Joffrey's cats, jungle cats, margays and oncillas, and pallas cats. European wild cats can breed with margays, and ocelots can breed with margays, and bobcats and lynxes can interbreed. So you can follow the chain of logic there. So you can go from a Siberian tiger down to a house cat through hybridization data. Now, because some species today are separated by their morphology and location or other factors that prevent hybridization. So that's why ultimately created kinds are determined pretty much by genetic studies, which kind of falls into your next question.
Yeah, what about animals that can't interbreed with each other of their own created kinds, such as foxes? Now, um, foxes, if my understanding is correct, can only interbreed with other foxes. Now, are they the same kind as canine, or could be same kind as canine, or are they their own kind?
So you brought up foxes, which are a tricky one because there's actually some debate going on right now whether true foxes like genus Vulpes, which is like red foxes, there's plenty, but red foxes are the common ones. There is some debate about whether foxes are canines or if they're in a different kind or not. So more genetic studies are being done on that. Again, we are not all knowing. We are learning things constantly too. Currently, we do treat foxes like they're in the same kind as other canines, but they are up for debate. Now, there are hybrids between like Halipex foxes, which are the false foxes, and domestic dogs that has been proven. But those false foxes are more genetically similar to jackals and wolves than like the Vulpes foxes. So more genetic studies are needed there as far as foxes go. With other creatures, sometimes species are incompatible with one another, like the tiger house cat example. Tigers weigh 40 times more than the largest house cats, so they're either going to eat them or squash them, right? So sometimes species in the same kind have no contact with each other anymore, so they don't have chances to hybridize with each other. However, humans who have put animals together before that would otherwise never see each other can sometimes be surprised when those animals hybridize. So for example, in 2019, researchers were really shocked, I think they were in Hungary, were shocked when the American paddlefish they were studying and the Russian sturgeons they were studying hybridized to produce hybrids called sturddlefish. We had no idea in the scientific community that that was possible because those two species belong to completely separate families. So this is where their kind would at least be at the order level, one higher. And because American paddlefish and Russian sturgeons would never interact in the wild, we would never know that they were related until we had this research project and oh, there they go, they hybridized. So now we as humans gave them the chance to hybridize. So that happened. I also recently published an article on cheetahs. We get a question about cheetahs a lot because cheetahs do not have hybrid data with any other cats, and they
I read
appear
the
a little.
article.
Oh, you did? Okay. So the issue with cheetahs is they are incredibly inbred. They are the genetic equivalent of cousins. Their immune systems are so similar that you could graft skin from a cheetah onto another cheetah with no issues because they all think they're the same. Their immune systems think they're the same. And that isolation, that inbreeding is likely due to a genetic bottleneck, which means cheetahs with their inbreeding have a lot of issues. 60% of them celebrate from erosion of their palate on their mouth, which leads to increased mortality. They have problems breeding because they have deleted sperm quality. They're actually below the threshold of infertility. They have high mortality rates for their juveniles. They have increased susceptibility to infection and disease. So these cheetahs are so inbred and struggle to breed with each other already that they're likely not going to be breeding with other cats.
So
So
interbreeding
unfortunately,
affects animals just as much as it affects humans, right?
oh
As far
yeah,
as mutations and stuff.
yeah, animals are affected by the same situation of our fallen world that humans are. And so you do end up with species like cheetahs who are just so inbred that they can barely breed with each other, that you're not going to see hybrid data necessarily with everything. And that's why hybridization is not necessary for a created kind, but hybridization proves the created kind, if that makes sense.
Yes. Um, all right. Um, so yeah, that does make sense, and I've actually read that in an article, Answers in Genesis. I liked it because that's something that I was wondering about myself on that. So it would be easier to sit there and say that if they can hybridize, if they can mate, then they're definitely part of the same created kind. But the fact that they don't is not a ruling factor that rules them out from being a created kind.
Right. So like your
Uh,
next question ties into that too.
right. I was just thinking about that, and I believe this. Yeah, should we judge the classification? Wait, did we do big cats already?
I kind of answered it in the last question about why big cats only mate with big cats, and it's because they're big cats and they're going to eat the little cats versus breed with them.
Can
And
they
like I said,
genetically, I mean, genetically speaking, like if someone took the genetics of a tiger and the genetics of a cat and put them together, would they be able to hybridize them?
I mean, in a lab maybe, but if you think about it, a Siberian tiger is 40 times the size of the largest house cat. Like, if the house cat's the one getting pregnant, they can't carry that to term. The size and compatibility is there. In a lab, I don't know. I honestly couldn't tell you.
Right.
But in today's world, yeah, you're not going to see a tiger mate with a house cat because it's going to eat the house cat, right? So,
So
but as I mentioned before, we have hybridization data linking us from tigers all the way down to house cats.
right. All right. So you would say that they're part of the same kind, but there are issues that involve with them actually interbreeding, such as size differences. That's a big one. Um, uh,
Location, the fact that the tiger's going to eat the cat, like,
right, right. No point in that happening. And of course, the cat would probably be too scared to
yeah.
approach it. All right. Okay. Now number 11. Yeah. Should we judge the classification of created kinds through our modern classification system, or are there limits to assuming there's a one-to-one comparison? I think we basically kind of went over that a lot earlier, but
Yeah.
essentially, our modern classification system is not going to be exact in terms of created kinds, as we already pointed out. Like
Yeah.
sometimes it might fall in order, sometimes it might fall in genus.
Yes.
On occasion, rare occasion, it might fall in species level. So it just depends on where they're setting the boundary versus, definition of biblical kinds. Because
Right.
biblical kinds, of course, came out first. The modern classification system is what, less than 300 years old?
1700s. Yeah. So
About 300? Yeah, that sounds right.
So I always say, it's a good baseline. And again, it helps us kind of organize and understand and study the modern world. But again, ultimately, our ultimate truth is scripture. And animals behave the way scripture tells us. They're not necessarily behaving the way man wants them to behave with our organizational system. So
A
it's a
lot
good,
of
it's a good baseline, but it's definitely not one to one or anything
Right.
definitive.
A lot of evolutionists, though, have taken this classification system to heart. Like if they classify humans and apes as primates, for example, and they use that as evidence against our position because they classified it this way. What would you say to someone who has kind of arbitrarily taken this classification system, like, oh yeah, I'm going to accept this, and say that that proves you wrong in terms of what you believe on this? What would you
I'm
say
kind
to
of going
that?
to get that into the next question, but that's basically circular reasoning. So, assuming life forms are evolutionary connected to argue for their relationships to show evidence for evolution is circular reasoning. And
Right.
keep in mind, too, taxonomy changes constantly. When molecules to man evolutionists talk about taxonomy, they tend to treat it like it's fixed. But oh my gosh, if you pay attention to scientific research and literature, taxonomy is moving around all the time. Like, we've had to change our signs multiple times because scientific names change so often because everything's getting moved and bumped around constantly. So it is not a fixed science,
Right.
even in their model.
Right. I agree. All right. Say, well, we're on number 12. This is one that has come up a lot recently. A lot of evolutionists bring it up. What about nested hierarchies? Are there certain similarities that prove that we are related to each other through various lines of successions, or are there these nested hierarchies better understood through a biblical perspective? Um, uh, Let me know what you know about this.
So for our watchers, so you guys know what nested hierarchies are, they're presumed ancestor-descendant relationships based on morphological similarities thought to be inherited from their ancestors. So homologies, basically. So examples of nested categories would be things like mammals, vertebrates, canines, things like that. And you usually see them in your textbooks drawn as diagrams. And while those drawn diagrams look very pretty with their lines and their nodes and everything, keep in mind a lot of that is based on assumption. It is not based on direct observational, testable, repeatable evidence in our world today. It is based on historical assumptions, which are based off of that person's worldview. So the drawn lines of those diagrams are masking blurry lines between fact and speculation. So when you look at nested hierarchies, I'm actually pulling this from an article on Answers in Genesis that talks about nested hierarchies because I think the author wrote this out really well. So when you look at a nested hierarchy, the first thing you should do is identify what the observational science is. Which parts of these diagrams can we actually observe as fact in the present? For example, we can observe as fact in the present that tigers and lions will hybridize with each other. Okay, they're related. They can share a nest in a hierarchy, right? But the tiger's connection to some mysterious ancestor millions of years ago, we cannot observe that. So then you want to identify the historical science in that diagram. So everything else about the diagram, including the lines drawing how organisms are related to each other and nodes representing presumed ancestors that are extinct, it's all interpretation about the unobservable past. So all of these diagrams are hypotheses. They're not definite facts. And that's why I mentioned earlier, the evolutionary family trees are changing constantly based on new data, new research, new assumptions that are coming up in the scientific world. So then when you're looking at these diagrams, identify the assumptions. And that's where I go back to, this is circular reasoning. The biggest problems with them is assuming living things are evolutionary related. You can't prove that. So they're assuming these things are evolutionarily related when they're drawing these diagrams. But again, assuming life forms are connected to argue for their relationships to show evidence for evolution is circular reasoning. So then as Christians, we should look at these hierarchies and think of alternative, explanations from a biblical worldview. Do similarities exist within animals? Yes. Why? There is a common designer, right? Again, God would have applied certain useful design plans like 4 limbs and breathing through lungs in some cases. Depending on the creature, you're going to see similarities because they have to serve similar functions in similar physical conditions on the same planet in the same conditions. So then you're going to identify the rest of the story, right? So what other observable facts are consistent with the biblical explanation for hierarchies as opposed to the evolutionary one? So mechanisms like mutation and natural selection, they exist, they affect changes in animals, but they do not create new kinds. We still have no evidence of a kind turning into a new kind. So these mechanisms can remove genetic variation to yield new species within kinds, which is consistent with created kinds, but they're not going to turn one kind into another. So they can't explain how novel life forms could arise on the evolutionary tree. So basically, nested hierarchies are there again to kind of help us study things, learn things, speculate relations, but a lot of it is not proved by testable, observable, repeatable evidence. So you just have to come at those with discernment and make sure you're standing on God's authority versus man's authority. And again, keep in mind, the evolutionary theory is so plastic, it changes all the time that they move stuff around constantly. That taxonomy is a very messy science. It's always changing based on new observations. So hopefully
Awesome.
that helps.
Right. So you would say that a lot of this stuff is based on circular reasoning, the way in which they're classifying things, and say, well, I classified this as this and this. Wait a minute, I also classified this as this and this. Oh, well, they must be related because they're all got that broader classification, and it's like they're just kind of arguing their way into a circle as a result.
Yeah, and a lot of it again is based on speculation. These extinct animals no longer exist. They are not here. We cannot draw blood from them. We cannot study them in the same way we can study animals alive today, right? So a lot of things are based on assumptions, based on things in the present. Hey, we can see this skull looks like a dog skull and a bear skull mashed together. So we'll call it maybe it belonged in the bear dog, or maybe it was its own thing, right? So we are limited by the same limitations.
Right.
So a lot of it is based on assumptions and guesses, which are based on worldview.
Awesome. All right. We're gonna come back to that, I guess. Actually, I got a clip here. I was gonna play the clip, but we're kind of running out of time. Yes, we didn't play the clip when I originally did the interview with Karina because I wanted to respect her time, and we were already running out of time as a result. So I decided, well, she already got made notes. I'll just go ahead and let her go over what she had. But for everybody else, I'm going to add this into editing because I want people to understand what me and Karina are talking about as we're going back and forth over this particular section of the video. It pertains to Erica's Creative Cons video, which I did do a response video to. But I didn't play this particular clip because I was saving it for when I talked to Karina on speciation and creative kinds. And so this is going to be from Erica's video on creative kinds, and this is going to be the clip that I sent Karina to respond to, and that she made notes on, and that me and her went back and forth on discussing it. So I'm gonna play this at this time, so that way everybody else kind of can follow along and understand what's going on. All right, here it is.
Creationists have their work cut out for them with human evolution and like grouping the hominins in particular. They don't separate out very nicely into different kinds, to be sure. But it's not just humans that give creationists issues when it comes to kind delineation. Because even when they use morphology, it's kind of just like a eyeball it methodology, right? It's not like listing out the actual physical criteria bit by bit and piece by piece as if finding a new fossil and publishing a description paper. It's as simple as this looks like X and this looks like Y. And that's really problematic. Let's go over a few fossil record examples to show you what I mean. So my specialty is obviously primates, and when we're looking at the extant primates, I think I've already kind of explained what some of the issues are, where we have chimpanzees and humans being distinctly different kinds, but we're just going to lump mandrills in with talapoins in a cercopithecid kind, calling it the old world monkeys. Double standard, kind of crazy, but it actually kind of gets worse with the fossils. In this silly little whiteboard diagram here, you can see that I have organism A and organism B, and they share a common ancestor 2 million years ago. As you travel back in time on both of these lineages towards their shared common ancestor, both organisms on both lineages are going to look more and more like one another because they're converging as we move backwards in time. So for creationists, you can hopefully see the issue that's going to inevitably pop up. It's easy for creationists to look at extant organisms and say, well, A is a kind and B is a kind. But what happens when you start to fill out the fossil record? What happens if you find their common ancestor? Well, then you might say that there's 3 different kinds, and they're just kind of similar to one another. That's silly, but whatever. And then you start to fill in the lineages, each one in its turn. And it starts to become very difficult to arbitrarily say that somewhere over here there's a kind, somewhere over here there's a kind, and somewhere up here is a kind. Let's look at 3 different accepted kinds according to Answers in Genesis for a moment. Here we have Canidae, Ursidae, and Hyenidae, represented by a wolf, a grizzly bear, and a spotted hyena. In conventional science, ursids and canids are more closely related to one another than either is to members of Hyenidae, and hyenids are actually feliforms, while ursids and canids are caniforms. This literally just means these guys are dog-like, this guy's cat-like, and over here is also like felines and mongooses and things like that, while over here you have like otters and raccoons and things like that. Quick question, what kind is Amphicyon? Amphicyon is actually a member of the family Amphicyonidae, and they're known for being the bear dogs. According to Donald Prothero in one of my sources here, Evolution, What the Fossils Say and Why It Matters, Amphicyonidae, or the bear dogs, are a sister group to bears generally. So Ursidae and Amphicyonidae are sister groups, and the two of them are sort of a group that is a sister combined to canids, so the dogs themselves. This is not confusing from an evolutionary perspective, right? Because although these groups are similar, they're occupying different niches, and most importantly, they share a common ancestor. They are related. But Answers in Genesis can't have that, so Amphicyonidae is actually its own separate kind. Well, okay. Now, what about Epicyon? What kind is Epicyon in? So Epicyon is actually a bone-crushing dog. It is a member of the subfamily Borophagidae within Canidae. Now, I've not seen Answers in Genesis talk about Epicyon, but since it is a member of Canidae, I guess they would just place it in the dog kind. But like Answers in Genesis would propose that it is not at all related whatsoever to Amphicyonidae, the bear dogs, or to Ursidae, the regular old bears. There is no relationship there at all, according to young Earth creationists. Okay, what about Hemisyon? Hemisyon is actually a dog bear, so it's like the opposite of what we saw with Amphicyon. And Hemisyon is technically a member of Ursidae, but that hasn't stopped Answers in Genesis from giving it its own family, its own unique kind. Yes, so that's right. Right now we have a dog kind, a bear kind, a dog bear kind, a bear dog kind, and a hyena kind. What the heck? Let's look at Chasmoporthetes and Borophagus. Now, if you're a keen-eyed viewer who's interested in skulls and the masticatory biomechanics, you might have noticed a little something about these two skulls. Borophagus is a lot more heavy-set. It's clearly a bone crusher and looks a whole lot like modern hyenas in that way. Meanwhile, poor Chasmoporthetes is more lightly built. It's more gracile in comparison. It looks more like modern wolves in that way. Borophagus has heavy-set jaws and is known for being a member of Borophaginae, the bone-crushing or hyena-like dogs. Meanwhile, Chasmoporthetes is known for being a gracile or dog-like hyena. I don't know where Answers in Genesis would place these guys, given Chasmoporthetes is generally considered to be a kind of distant member of Hyenidae. They might just drop it in that bucket, and given Borophagus is a member of Canidae, they might place it there, or they might do what they did with the bear dogs and the dog bears and give them each their own unique kind. Who is to say? Here's a graphic I made to show what it would look like. Here's the skulls and crania if we're grouping Epicyon and Borophages with Canidae and Chasmoporthetes with Hyenidae. It looks even sillier when we take post-crania into account. I mean, just look at how arbitrary this all is. The problem, remember, isn't grouping these organisms by physical characteristics. It's doing that and then subsequently saying that none of these groups are related to one another. And then here's the less conservative estimate if we group the way that they've been grouping so far, where we have dog bears and bear dogs and hyena dogs and dog hyenas and regular dogs, regular bears, and regular hyenas. Silly. Just to really hammer home my point, though, here are 3 Eocene organisms: Orohippus, Hyracheirus, and Hyloledes. In conventional science, each of these guys is actually a basal member of their respective lineages into the modern day, with Orohippus being an early horse, Hyracheirus being an early rhinoceros, and Hyloledes being an early tapir. This makes sense because rhinoceroses, tapirs, and horses are all perissodactyls. They share a common ancestor, so moving back in time in each of these lineages should produce organisms that look progressively similar as we approach the last common ancestor between the 3. But because of Baraminology's assertion that created kinds are not related at all to one another, you might end up with an organization like this, where Orohippus, Hyracheirus, and Hyloledes are not at all related, and instead they represent basal forms of each of their respective kinds, which just so happen to look extremely similar, as if converging on a last common ancestor between the 3. But this is the problem with just giving a blanket categorization to your kinds, like roughly at the family level, instead of getting down and dirty and actually looking for characteristics that unite certain organisms. And then, of course, there's the problem that this is inherently flawed because it doesn't take into account that each family is related to each other family by varying degrees. As a young Earth creationist, I don't think you can use families as your created kinds without grappling with the fact that those families are in fact informed by evolutionary theory and relationships. So what are we actually left with here? Because interbreeding can't determine created kinds, and neither can genetics, and neither can morphology. Those latter two, not the least of which because they'll end up grouping humans with the other apes, which is something young Earth creationists can't have. What will they do? How do you actually determine created kinds? Can it even be done? Well, the answer, of course, is no, because created kinds are not real. There are no magical, invisible barriers that exist between made-up groups of living organisms. The truth is, all categorizations that we try to impose on the tree of life are going to end up as problematic, even those in secular science. Species, after all, are static concepts applied to dynamic systems. Populations of organisms are always changing through time, and so drawing a line where one species begins and another one ends is a difficult task, to be sure. I would argue that it's an impossible one, to be honest, but we can at least attempt it, and it can be supremely useful for understanding biology and biodiversity. But this is only because species as a concept, by its very nature, speciation, recognizes that populations of organisms do change over time, and that there is no limit to the type of change that populations can undergo given the right mutations and the right amount of time, along with the right pressures. The concept of created kinds was killed the moment we figured out that there is no such barrier that exists to the type of change that organisms can actually undergo. There is no boundary that exists between these so-called created kinds. All life smudges into all other life given a wide enough lens. And so the creationists, and specifically young Earth creationists, have their work cut out for them. They need to provide a standardized methodology to separate out the created kinds, either morphologic standards that can be applied across the entire tree of life, or some kind of genetic gap that can be identified that separates out some as yet undiscovered grouping pattern within organisms that so far only seems to look like evolutionary theory.
Now, you noticed, you probably noticed a lot of the responses that we already have because we responded to several things that she already said already during the course of the video you're watching right now. And you probably already realized that you've already spotted the assumptions, the circular reasoning, her straw man arguments, her constantly switching back and forth the terms, equivocating, species, population, changing over time, things that we don't disagree with, and that sort of thing. You saw her going back and forth on it. You probably already identified it. I thought Karina did an excellent job of responding to a lot of these criticisms. We've already brought up several of them, and we're not even done yet because Karina's got more to add to the pot of responding to Erica's clip on this. Let's see what she has to say. Do you have notes maybe from what you saw of that clip? It's from
Yeah.
Erica's video.
Yes. So I think we mentioned this before, is she's starting from a different foundation than we are, and she also gets some of what we teach wrong. So we have to remember that she's basing her knowledge on man's ideas. We are basing our knowledge on God's ideas. She's relying on a lot of these historical sciences. There's a lot of assumptions that we've kind of discussed previously, whereas we're relying on scripture, right? We know that humans are not animals because God tells us in scripture that we're made in the image of God, but someone not standing on the authority of God is not going to know or maybe accept that. She is also has a fundamental misunderstanding of our thoughts. She mentions a couple times that she thinks we base kinds on morphology, and that's not true. We've already discussed that. Going back to again, we can't look at these animals in person. We can't say for sure about any of these things. And there's not really a problem if they are all in all different kinds. So maybe there were just many, many kinds. Maybe they belong to kinds that exist today. I know she showed comparisons of like horse, rhino, tapir ancestors looking similar, but we can see from their modern representatives that they are very different, right? It kind of goes back to that morphology issue. We know rhinos aren't going to breed with horses, so we know that they're different kinds. But fundamentally, going back to the main problem with molecules to man evolution, she cannot explain how one kind turns into another kind, right? So without a mechanism to turn these kinds into another kind, this whole evolutionary tree hierarchy falls apart because there's no mechanism to go from a molecule to a man. So ultimately, that is the core problem with the molecule cement evolutionary model. There's no mechanism that can cause changes in kinds.
Right. There's no mechanism to add new information either, which you would have to have in order to, and you, I think you described it earlier, like what, millions of new information, billions of new information that has to be added constantly. Because so it can't be just one time added or just a rare time like here and there. It's got to be constant in the
Yeah.
chain of organisms changing over time and all the organisms on planet Earth, especially if you also dealing with plants too.
Yeah. Plants, fungi, oh my gosh, yeah, bacteria, you can get in a whole thing.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, the fact is with some of those extinct animals she was showing, they may have belonged to some of the same kinds that exist today. They may have belonged to their own separate kind. We
They
don't
might
know. They no
they may
longer,
even belong to kinds that went extinct, which
right.
is another question I have. I think I haven't asked this question yet, but it's one on my list. I'll just go
Yeah.
ahead and ask it. Have their kinds gone extinct? I know dinosaurs are considered extinct today, and they had like how many, 60 kinds or something like that among dinosaurs?
Our current research estimates there are about 60 to 80 dinosaur kinds. Again, they are no longer here for us to study in person, so we cannot say for sure, but current research suggests maybe 60 to 80 kinds. Obviously, they are all presumed extinct, but dinosaurs are far from the only animal category that has gone extinct. Synapsids are an entire class of animals that are gone, and we estimate there were about 78 kinds of those. They're all gone. So yes, many kinds have sadly gone extinct because we live in a fallen world. I can't tell you exactly how many because I'm not omniscient,
Right.
but yes, it is possible for entire kinds to go extinct.
Okay. Awesome. Oh, well, not awesome, but yeah.
I know, yeah.
But all right. What is the creation orchard? That's something that gets talked about a lot with Answers in Genesis. I know it's contrary. It's working contrary to the belief of Charles Darwin on the tree of life, and that's one of the Charles Darwin's views is still held by evolutionists today concerning that because they see all life is a tree, and YC say nope, it's more like an orchard. So
Right.
could you explain that?
The tree of life, which is the molecule cement evolutionary model, basically says down here at the bottom is your one mysterious common ancestor that somehow spontaneously arose, right? And from that one ancestor, you get every life form that's ever existed, right?
Including plants.
Yep, plants, fungi, bacteria, humans, animals, every form of life comes from that one ancestor. However, the orchard shows that there are multiple common ancestors to the life we see today. And each of those ancestors was the created kinds made during creation week. And all the branches on the tree coming up from that ancestor, all this is the speciation. It's all the animals we see today, some that have gone extinct, you know. So there are many trees in the original garden of life, and each tree represents a different kind. And within that kind, you get a lot of variation, but you don't see a kind turning into a new kind. And there's not one common ancestor, there are many common ancestors.
Right. Some argue that biodiversification can happen as fast as it did following Noah's flood, where lots of species, some people will attack the Noah's flood incident and say all the species that exist today cannot possibly have biodiversified from just the amount of times it was on Noah's Ark. Some people have tried to level that type of argument at us. So what would be your response? Is there actual studies that have been done? I know I read some studies that have been done on this in John Woodmore-App's a Noah's Ark and feasibility study.
Yeah,
He mentioned some studies relating to biodiversification that's happened both with evolutionists and creationists have done these studies. Yes, I have the book here, Noah's Ark, a feasibility study, in which case he mentions several examples right here. So you can see it good. Here, got all kinds of examples of rapid speciation from both creationists. He mentions Jones et al. He mentioned Briggs. Have compiled numerous examples of various invertebrates and vertebrates giving rise to new species and genera in thousands of years or even less. Some of these examples have subsequent been subject to detailed studies For example, Barry has updated the long available evidence for speciation in mice in only a few decades, whereas Cornfield, 1978, has investigated the origin of reproductively isolated species of African uh, cichlid fishes in early 5,000 years. As if this were not enough, Owen et al. Have recently shown that some cichlid, if I pronounce that correctly, Cichlid. I'm pronouncing it cichlid. It might not be the correct way to pronounce that. I might be butchering the pronunciation of that. But fish species has arisen in merely 200 years. One consequently of glaciation, several thousand years, is that the tropics have much undergone profound climate changes because belts of rainforests must have shifted considerably during glacial and interglacial intervals. He names some sources on this. He says, as a consequence, many has provided evidence that species of Central African beetles have arisen within only 5,000 years, and Moreau, 1966, has allowed for extensive speciation among tropical birds within a comparable period of time. The conditions immediately after the floods, single pair founders of new populations, uh, uh, vacant vacant niches, novel environments, and other factors must have facilitated the rapid diversification within kinds released from the ark, accumulating in the rapid origin of present-day species. That's on page 181 of his book. So yeah, rapid speciation. There's lots of studies that have been done on rapid speciation. She's going to give some as well. You're going to see that. Um, and it's pretty cool. She gives ones even more recent. Like I think one example she gives is within 4 years. So we got examples of studies that have shown rapid speciations within our lifetime. We got some that are beyond our lifetime, but within a couple hundred years, and in some cases even thousands. But so 4,000 years is enough time to give speciation to happen. Time in the arc. So when critics bring up this example and say this disproves this, I heard William Lane Craig bring up Hugh Ross's speculation on this that speciation could not possibly have enough time. Hugh Ross is an older creationist. This just shows that people that bring this objection up are ignorant of the studies that have been done. There have been studies that have been done by evolutionists. There's been studies been done by creationists, and they all show that rapid speciation can happen, especially under certain conditions and that sort of thing. And so, what a lot of people assume is that the general population in the current environments and things like that, if they happen really slow, then that must mean that speciation cannot happen fast. But under certain conditions, especially under conditions following the arc, speciation would have happened very fast and very rapidly. So a lot of times these objections are and speculations about whether speciation can happen very fast are based upon lack of knowledge of studies that have been done on this. Experimental evidence has showed this is false. So we're going to show what Karina has to say on this.
Yes, so even molecules to man evolutionists have recognized that speciation can happen very quickly. So here's a quote from a study published in Discover. It says, researchers who once assumed evolution required millennia are documenting species adapting in mere decades or even shorter time frames. Adaptation is happening right under our noses in our lifetime. Species are evolving at speeds that Darwin could not have imagined. So animals are able to change very, very quickly. So that quote comes from a study that watched guppies, which are a type of fish, speciate in 4 years. It just took 6 to 8 generations to completely speciate a new species of guppy. They also talk about the mosquitoes that colonized the London Underground in the 1860s and are now so distinct from above ground species that they typically won't mix with them. There's Chinook salmon. There's a group of Chinook salmon that took just 90 years to become a genetically distinct species from other Chinook salmon due to increased commercial fishing after the 1920s. Some green anoles in Florida took about 15 years to turn into a new species after an invasion of brown anoles. Sockeye salmon in Lake Washington diverged into a distinct population in just 60 years. So speciation can happen very quickly, and we see it all the time. You don't need thousands, millions of years to speciate. You can do it in a few generations. But keep in mind with the speciation, right? The guppies are still guppies. The salmon are still salmon. The anoles are still anoles. They are not turning into new kinds. They are just diversifying, adapting into a new species. Now, human intervention can speed things up even more. As we talked about the dog breeds, our selective breeding has really sped up the diversification within dogs. Domestication of a silver variant of red foxes, some Russian researchers did that in just 50 years. So humans can speed that process up even further if we're, selective breeding.
Right.
So
And there's also some unique perspectives in that in terms of the situation with Noah, because when you have a new pair in an ecosystem that nobody else exists in, you don't have to worry about predators, do you?
they had the animals coming off Noah's Ark had like no competition in the whole world to find an area for themselves. And that's why we see kind of an explosion around that time of like everything. So if you're thinking about the animals that God would have chosen to put on Noah's Ark, because God brought the animals to Noah, he's probably going to be choosing animals with very good genetics, lots of potential, right? So you're going to see an explosion in like everything possible from these animals for the next bit, potentially. And then potentially over time, maybe they leveled out kind of into what we've got today. Again, that's all speculation. We weren't there. We can't tell you for sure. But yes, I mean, God likely would have brought these animals with a lot of genetic potential that then, you had a lot of variety available after the flood to spread throughout the world in these different habitats and biomes. And that's why we have bears in the tundra and the desert. So,
Right. And of course, some species were on Noah's Ark because they came after Noah's Ark. Like, for example, the polar bear, because they
not
lost
polar bears on Noah's Ark. Yeah, it was
yeah,
the bear kind. Yep.
yeah, and they were. I think everyone agrees that they kind of came about as a result of the Ice Age. They lost the pigment or something like that in the fur. I think there's some research that have been done that says they're related to the brown bear. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're all the same kind, the bear kind. And I was going to talk about it later, but there is fossil evidence of brown bears and polar bears hybridizing thousands of years ago, right? So again, that shows they're all bears. They all came from the same bear ancestors, and just they carry their genetic information with them as they spread throughout the world and eventually end up with isolated populations that fit best into their environments.
Awesome. Are all hybrids sterile? I know that's a question you've dealt with before.
No, they are not. It's a very common myth. In fact, many hybrids are fertile. This common myth probably comes about because the most common hybrid, which is the mule, that's a cross between a female horse and a male donkey, they are usually sterile, not always. So back in 2018, there was actually a mule here in Kentucky named Peanut that had a baby. So mules can sometimes have babies. But because equine species today have differing numbers of chromosomes, many times when they hybridize, the offspring end up with uneven chromosomes, which makes them sterile. So because equine hybrids are probably the most commonly known hybrids, and because they are often sterile, I think people think all hybrids are sterile or somehow inferior, but that's not true. A lot of hybrids are fertile enough to contribute DNA back to their parental populations, and sometimes the hybrids are more fit than their parent species. And sometimes scientists have realized animals they believe to be their own species are just really common hybrids. So for example, the Clymene dolphin was categorized as its own species, but genetic studies revealed that it's just a hybrid between spinner and striped dolphins that happens so commonly that they thought it was its own species. Sometimes when you go far enough back in an animal's genetics, they're hybrids. So like many pure species we consider pure today, such as polar bears, jaguars, even Darwin's tanagers, they all have mixing in their DNA if you go back far enough. So hybridization is not new. We have evidence of it even in the fossil record. It could be a cause of, speciation in some cases. Hybridization can be a problem for molecules to man evolution, but it makes perfect sense in a biblical worldview that animals who are in the same kind, who are able to, may hybridize.
And horses and donkeys, even though most time it's usually occurred in a lab, it has been known to occur in the wild too.
Oh, horses and donkeys interbreed on their own all the time. We get mules and hinnies all over the place. So yeah, there is plenty of hybridization that occurs in nature. Some people think hybridization only occurs under human care, but that is not true. There's tons of hybrids out there. If you want to have fun, you can go online and look up animal hybrids and you'll be shocked to see what you find. I know here in the US, some common ones are coy wolves, coyote wolf hybrids, the Growler and Pisley bears, which are the brown bear, polar bear hybrids up north, Blinxes, bobcat lynxes, Arctic Ocean, Narlugas, narwhal beluga hybrids. I could go on, but there are plenty of hybrids that occur in nature without any human intervention.
Right. You mentioned hennies. Is it my understanding that Creation Museum have hennies?
We do not. We have at the Ark Encounter Zoo, we have a Zorse. She is half zebra, half horse, and a Zonkey, who is half zebra, half donkey.
Wow, that's pretty cool. All right, so I guess we're at the end here. Do you have any final thoughts to leave us on Created Kinds by which you want to share? Anything to you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I know that it's important to make that distinction among created kinds when you are talking about the biblical view of animals, because it is quite different from the evolutionary model. But going back to the importance of defining terms when you're talking to people, what do you mean by evolution? What do you mean by species when you're having those kind of discussions? Ultimately, I tell people when you are arguing against molecules to man evolution, there's really only two foundational problems that you have to keep going back to. And one is life can't arise from non-life. And two is that, again, there is no process or mechanism by which new genetic information can be added to an organism's genetic code to turn one kind of animal into another kind of animal that would lead to molecules to man evolution. So without a mechanism to turn one kind into another, molecules to man evolution falls apart, no matter what else they say. Whereas the biblical worldview shows, yes, there are changes within animals. We see that, we test that, we observe that, but there's no kind changes, right? There's speciation within kinds, but there's no kind turning into a new kind. And the observable, testable, repeatable evidence we see in our world today confirms what the Bible teaches about animals.
Awesome. All right. Thank you again for joining us on this about speciation and Created Kinds.
Very well.
Yeah, I thought it was awesome, and learned a lot, and I hope everybody else has learned a lot. Thank you again. I appreciate it. And is there anything else you want to say before signing out?
I don't think so, but thank you for having me. I had a good time.
Me too. God bless.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on Apologetics 101 and the Genesis series. I hope you liked the interview with Karina Altman. I thought she did an excellent job, and we went over a lot of specifics, a lot of details, and so in just the span of 1 hour, or a little over an hour, so it was a really good interview. I enjoyed my discussion with her. Stay tuned for more from both the Genesis series and the Tompkins controversy. Um, I'm gonna wait a little bit on. 'Cause one video I want to do is to show difference between humans and apes, and um, I wanted to do "Are We Apes?" is what the title of the video is going to be. It's going to be in the Genesis series. I'm gonna see if I can get Dr. Georgia Purdom, who I understand from Answers to Genesis have had a lot of experience dealing with the subject matter and writing on it, and she's already said that she could be able to do that. So I'm thinking about having her on here to have that discussion with me, but because I just had her on here not too long ago, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do the Tompkins controversy next. Or the next episode of the Tompkins controversy, which is going to be a big video. It's going to be called Gap versus Ungap. It's going to be mostly responding to Glenn Williamson and some responding to Erica, but mostly responding to Glenn Williamson. And it's going to be pretty cool. It's going to have a lot of interesting subjects to discuss, particularly his arguments concerning whether Tompkins divided by the Corey length, and we're going to get into that as well as some stuff he said on Lassie and Nutmere and things like that. And it's going to be pretty cool. It's going to be a pretty cool video. It's going to be the one of two big videos I have left in this series. The second one being weighted versus unweighted, which is going to follow that one eventually. And following that will be the episode that will cap off the series of Tompkins controversy. And then that way I could just kind of focus just on the Genesis series for a while, unless I have another series come up or something. And make sure you if you're not a subscriber to my channel, subscribe. I make videos on Christian apologetics, and I do a lot of stuff concerning Christian apologetics in general. But I also my channel is mostly an apologetic response channel, so I do respond to other people. So subscribe if that's kind of subjects interest you and conversations. I have interviews on this channel. It's pretty cool. And make sure you like the videos. That helps the YouTube algorithm, gets this information out there to more people. Puts those videos on the front page of Google or YouTube, and people looking for the content or general content, even if they don't look for the name, the video might pop up or something if a lot of people like the video. So don't forget to like it. I know it's easy to forget to like the video, but make sure you give the video a thumbs up. And of course, hit the notification bell so you can be notified of all future videos on this channel, because we have a lot of videos in store. And I hope you like my little headset. I know it's different from my original mic. The original mic I had was this right here, and it's a $200 mic. It's pretty cool, but it's unfortunately the wire kept getting in the way, and it was annoying and distracting. Plus, it kept jarring because I would have it on the front because I have limit on my ports and stuff, and it just wasn't working out very well. I really like this. It's got its own little dongle to connect. It does really well in terms of headsets and recording, and so I think I'm going to start using this more often. And unless I get something else as well appropriate for the situation of me recording YouTube videos. So if you like this setup, let me know in the comment section. Let me know what you think of the video. And again, thank you again for joining me on here, and we'll see you on the next one.